G'day everyone, and welcome to another second gear low video. Today I'm going to be looking at how to change the tie rod and relay rod ends on our 1995 Toyota Landcruiser, but the video is going to apply to all 80 and 105 series cruisers as well. I'm going to be installing some high quality aftermarket parts from Terrain Tamer. This kit comes with everything you'll need to do the job. It's worth noting there are two different kits, one for left-hand drive and one for right-hand drive cruisers like this one. So let's get into it. I'm going to quickly run through all the tools and parts we need to do the job. There'll be a full list along with timestamps to skip ahead in the description below. I've got a metric socket set with 12, 17, 19 and 21mm sockets, along with a 17mm spanner and a torque wrench to suit. I've got a pipe wrench suitable for about a 25 to 26mm or 1-inch OD pipe, along with some needle nose pliers. Got some safety glasses and nitrile gloves for protection. Up the back we've got some degreaser, some WD-40 and some paper towel, along with an old toothbrush or a small wire brush works really well. And we've got some anti-seize lubricant. Over here you can use a ball joint separator tool, or if you don't have one of those you can use a soft face hammer like brass or copper, along with a regular steel hammer. And we've got measuring tape as well. For the parts we're going to be installing, the Terrain Tamer kit comes with both tie rod ends, both relay rod ends, and all new castellated nuts and split pins as well. And lastly, we'll just need a jack and two jack stands. I'm going to start by cracking the wheel nuts on both front wheels using my 21mm socket. Next, I'm going to jack up the front axle and get jack stands under both sides. As always, don't forget to chock your back wheels. I'm happy with how that's sitting on the jack stands now, so I'm going to whip each of the front wheel nuts off and remove the wheels. Looking up underneath the front of the Landcruiser now, and we can see our two steering linkages. We've got the tie rod located behind the axle there, and the relay rod, also known as a drag rod or drag link, just here. On the driver's side, the relay rod is connected to the pitman arm, and on the passenger side it's connected to the steering knuckle. So when you turn your steering wheel, the pitman arm is going to rotate, and that's going to apply a force to the steering knuckle on the passenger side through that relay rod, causing the wheel to turn. Then behind that, the tie rod connects the steering knuckle on the passenger side to the steering knuckle on the driver's side, so that when one wheel turns, the other one does as well. Note up the top here we've got our steering dampener, which is connected to the relay rod here, so we're going to need to temporarily disconnect that to replace this relay rod end. I'm going to start with the tie rod, and I'm on the passenger side. There'll be a split pin we need to remove before we can take off the castellated nut, so grab your needle nose pliers and we'll bend that split pin out. Once that's nice and straight, we should be able to pull it out the other side. This particular split pin's quite stuck because it's a little bit too big for the hole. So I'm going to grab my vice grips and clamp down on there, and then hit that with a hammer to get it the last little bit. And there we go. Make sure you throw those split pins away and use a new one. Then I'll grab my 19mm socket and we're going to loosen off that castellated nut. In this case we can get rid of that nut because we're going to be putting new ones on. Now this is where that ball joint separator tool comes in handy, particularly if these haven't been disconnected for a long time and are fairly seized. So you want to slide the fork in underneath the boot of the ball joint there. So as we tighten this bolt up here, this bottom part of the tool is going to push up on the stud and push it through the steering arm. This particular tool takes a 19mm socket. And there we go, that's just cracked. That was fairly loose because we've had these off recently, but sometimes they can go with quite a bang. So now I'm going to jump over to the driver's side and do the same thing. Just going to first bend out that split pin. Same as before, we can throw that one out and use our 19mm socket to remove that castellated nut. Then I can grab my tool again and slide it in and start to tighten that down. And you can see that let go with a bit of a bang. Now before we go any further and completely remove that tie rod from the car, I'm just going to write an L and an R on each side with a paint pen so I don't lose track of which side was which. The next step's really important, and that's to measure and record the overall effective length of our tie rod between the two ball joints. And that's because this is what determines our wheel alignment. So when we put the new joints in, we're going to try and match this measurement as close as possible. So we're going to measure from the center of this ball joint to the center of the other ball joint using our measuring tape. And as per the factory service manual, you should get about 1,233 millimeters. So I've measured that and I'm going to write it down. In order to approximate the overall length though, we just need to look at the number of threads sticking out past the end of the rod. So we're going to count the number on each end and record that as well. Once you've measured that overall length and you've counted the number of threads exposed at both ends, we can move on to removing the tie rod ends. In order to remove that first tie rod end, I'm just going to pop it loosely back down into the steering arm and put my castellated nut back on. Then I'm just going to snug that down with my 19mm socket. Now that that's snug, we'll grab our 17mm socket and our 17mm ring spanner and we'll loosen this clamp bolt here. If you find that your clamp bolt, nut, or the clamp itself are in particularly bad condition, you can buy replacements for these as well. So now that that clamp bolt is loose and the tie rod end is still fastened into the steering arm here, we should be able to rotate the tie rod itself to remove it from the tie rod end. Before we do that though, I'm going to take my WD-40 and spray some down into the channel in between the clamp here. I'm doing that because quite often these can be rusted inside and particularly difficult to get off. Next, I'm going to take my pipe wrench and use that to loosen the tie rod. Now the tie rod ends are right threaded at the right hand end and left threaded at the left hand end. I'm starting with the right end, so I need to turn this anti-clockwise to loosen. There we go, that's just starting to come a bit more easily now. I've had to use the cheater bar, which is a big steel pipe, over the pipe wrench here. Because of the amount of corrosion in the threads, it can be very difficult to get these off. Unfortunately, we are going to put a few marks into the paint in the tie rod here, so we can touch those up before we put it back on the car. If you know these haven't been changed for a long time, it's definitely worth spraying some penetrating fluid in there and leaving it overnight. We'll hang on to that clamp because we're going to reuse it. With the tie rod out of the way, we can simply loosen that 19mm nut. And that one can go in the bin. Then we're going to flip it round and do the same thing to the other end of the tie rod. 17mm socket and 17mm spanner. As before, I'm going to clean up those bolts and nuts and reuse them. Now this time being the left hand end of the tie rod, it's a left thread here, so we're going to need to turn it clockwise to loosen. Yeah, there we go. Alright, so this one's not as corroded as the other end. Still found I needed my cheater bar to get it started though. That one can go in the bin too. Now it's time to do some cleaning, and I'm going to start by degreasing the outside of the tie rod. We're going to focus most of our attention on trying to clean out any corrosion from inside the two ends of the tube, because that's going to impact how easily we can thread in our new tie rod ends. So I'm going to take my small brass wire brush. You can use an old toothbrush for this as well, but a wire brush is going to be more effective. I'm happy with how clean that's looking, so I'll move on to the other end. And then I'm just using a bit of paper towel to try and get the last of that degreaser out. It's a good idea to give those clamp bolts a bit of a freshen up as well. If you're interested, you can buy 10 packs of these little brass wire brushes online, and they're super handy when it comes to cleaning car parts. Now that we're done with all the cleaning, we're going to install our two new tie rod ends into the tie rod. They look very similar, but again, one of them's a left thread and the other's a right thread. So I'm going to start with the right thread, going into the right hand end of the tie rod. We're going to install a healthy amount of anti-seize. I'm using a Permatex anti-seize lubricant, reason being that it's going to prevent corrosion on the threads and make sure that this can move easily, for example, if we're doing a wheel alignment. So I'm going to put plenty along the threads there. I'm going to need to turn this one clockwise to get it started. And there we go, that's threading in nice and easily now. And I can see all the threads are getting a good coating of the anti-seize, which is what we want. I'm actually going to wind it all the way in so I get all the threads coated. And then I'm going to back it off by the number of threads that I had exposed before. Then we can wipe up that excess. Try not to get this on your clothes, it's nasty stuff, it gets everywhere. And now I'm just going to check and count the threads to make sure it's the same as what I started with. I'm happy with that, so I'm just going to loosely install that clamp bolt. We won't tighten that up until it's back on the car. You do just want to make sure that the clamp has the open section in line with the open section on the rod, because that's going to provide the force to clamp that shut and stop the tie rod from moving. Then I'll grab my new left tie rod end. Same again, plenty of anti-seize on there. And this one's going to need to be turned anti-clockwise to tighten, so the opposite of a standard right thread. And that one's going in pretty nicely as well. Put this clamp bolt in loosely. Same thing, we're clamping across the split in the rod. One final check, we'll take the measuring tape and we'll confirm that we've got about the same measurement that we had at the start from center of ball joint to center of ball joint. That's looking good, so let's put it back on the car. So I'll pop the tie rod back in, going on top of the radius arms, down through the hole in the steering knuckle, and I can install one of my two new castellated nuts. And we'll snug that one down with the 19mm socket. Then we need to torque this one up, and the torque spec for these is 67 foot-pounds, which is 91 Newton meters. Next, we need to grab our new split pin and find where the holes in the stud line up with the holes in the nut. We should be able to poke it through. And you can use your needle nose pliers to bend that split pin out. Then I'm just going to tap it with the hammer to bend it around the nut. Then with my 17mm spanner and my 17mm socket, I'm going to tighten that clamp bolt. There is a torque spec for the clamp nut, and it's 27 foot-pounds or 37 Newton meters. And then we can move over and do the same thing on the other end. I have given these steering arms a bit of a clean up with some degreaser as well. This driver's side steering arm should be free to rotate, so I can line that up with my new ball joint. Pop a new castellated nut on, and snug that down with my 19mm. Same as the other side, 67 foot-pounds, 91 Newton meters. And then we can install that split pin. Then I can tighten up my clamp bolt to 27 foot-pounds, 37 Newton meters. Onto the relay rod now, and you can see we've got a nut here connecting the steering damper to that relay rod end. So I'm going to start by removing that, and it's going to take a 17mm socket. Note that if you have an aftermarket lift kit installed, you might have a different arrangement here for the steering dampener. So I'm going to hold on to that nut, and we're going to reuse it when we put this back into the new relay rod end. I'm going to leave that steering dampener hanging there out of the way for now, and we'll put it back in afterwards. So here's one of the reasons you might want to replace these ball joints. You can see this grease leaking out here. Each ball joint has a rubber boot on it which contains that grease and also stops contaminants getting in. But as that rubber degrades with time and wears away, it's going to allow dirt to get in there as well as the grease to get out, and that's going to reduce the stiffness in the joint and therefore potentially create play in your steering. So I'm going to remove this split pin. That one can go in the bin as well. Then I'll grab my 19mm socket and loosen off this castellated nut. If you don't have one of these ball joint separator tools, you can probably tell by now they're super useful for this job. You can pick them up from your local auto parts store. They're usually around $50. Similar thing on the passenger side now. We need to start by removing that split pin, followed by the castellated nut. Then we can give that a bit of a clean. Don't forget to put your left and right on there before you remove it from the car. And we're again going to measure the distance between the center of the two ball joints before we replace them. And for the relay rod, it should be about 1090 millimeters. And just like with the tie rod, we're also going to count the number of threads at each end and record that. When we're installing the new tie rod or relay rod ends, we should aim to have about the same number of threads showing at each end. And the reason for that is that when the two ball joints are fixed in the steering arms, they go to rotate the rod to do a wheel alignment. And if you've got the same number of threads showing at each end, the rod is going to get to the end of the travel at both ends at the same time, and you're not going to be cut short with how much you can lengthen or shorten the bar. So when you're counting the number of threads that you have to begin with, you might have, for example, 8 on one end and 12 on the other. In that case, when you put the new ones on, you would put 10 at both ends because the overall length will be the same, but that way you'll have the same number of threads at each end moving forward. I'm going to loosen off the clamp bolt with my 17mm socket and spanner. I'll put them in the pile to be cleaned. It's a good idea to get this nut back on and snug it down if you can, but in this case it's too damaged, I can't get the nut back on, so I'm going to try and do the next step without it. For the relay rod ends, they're the opposite of the tie rods, so the left hand end is a right thread and the right end is a left thread. This is the left hand end here with a right hand thread, a standard thread, so I'm going to need to turn this counterclockwise to get it loose. There we go, that's starting to come now. Tends to get easier after that first little bit. Now we'll just remove it the rest of the way by hand. There we go, in the bin. Onto the clamp bolt now. Absolutely make sure you loosen this before you start trying to loosen the tie rod end itself, because you'll definitely break the ball joint if you don't. Again, I'm going to spray some WD-40 down in there. And this being the right hand end of the relay rod, it'll be a left thread, so I need to turn it clockwise to loosen it. And there we go, that one didn't need the cheater bar, which is good. And now we're going to follow pretty much the same process we did for the tie rod, making sure we get those threads nice and clean for the new ends. If the clamps aren't lined up correctly as well, make sure you line that up with the slot like we said before. Now that that's all cleaned up, we're going to follow a very similar process to the tie rod ends. I'm going to start with the right end, which has the steering dampener attachment on it. Apply my anti-seize along the thread again. And because this is the right end, it's a left thread, so I'm turning anti-clockwise to screw it in. Similar to before, this is going in much easier than the old one came out, which is good to see. So I'm going to set my threads now, and then I'm going to loosely install my clamp bolt. And lastly, the left-hand end of the relay rod, which will be a standard right thread. It's worth noting as well that on the tie rod we had both ball joints pointing in the same direction, but on the relay rod they need to be the opposite. So when one's going down, the other one needs to be up. One last check before we put this back on the car, just to confirm that the overall length between the two ball joints is what we were expecting, which should be around the 1090 millimeters, but whatever you wrote down at the start. And that's looking good, so we'll pop this back in the car. Starting off on the passenger side, I'm going to pop my new ball joint down through the steering arm. New castellated nut. You can allow the steering arm to rotate until it hits the stopper on the other side as well, so you've got something to pull against. Then we're going to torque up the castellated nut, same as for the tie rod ends, 67 foot-pounds or 91 Newton meters. Then we'll find our hole for our split pin, pop that through and bend it out. So we'll repeat that process on the driver's side. This time it's got to come up through the hole in the pitman arm. I'm going to give that a few taps to get it started. Then we'll put our new castellated nut on. And this one's also going to get torqued up to 67 foot-pounds or 91 Newton meters. we'll pop that last split pin through. Lastly, we just need to put our steering dampener back in and reinstate the nut. This one gets torqued up to 54 foot-pounds, which is 74 Newton meters, with a 17mm socket. I just want to highlight quickly that it's really important that we take the car for a professional wheel alignment after doing this job. Even though we've approximated the length of the tie rod and the relay rod to be what they were before, they will have changed slightly, which is going to affect our steering geometry. So it's really important we get that corrected to be back within spec. If you know you're going to be doing this job soon, it's not a bad idea to book in for that wheel alignment for just afterwards, so you don't have to wait. At this point, we're ready to get the wheels back on and the car back on the ground. I'm just going to snug them all for now. We'll do the final tighten when the wheel's back on the ground. Now I'm going to lift that front axle and remove the jack stands. And then lower the car back to the ground. Alright, so lastly we just need to torque all the wheel nuts up on those two front wheels. If you've got alloy wheels on the 80 series, it's 76 foot-pounds or 103 Newton meters, but for steelies like these, it's 109 foot-pounds, which is 147 Newton meters. Well, that's it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. If you've got any feedback for us or something you'd like to see in a future video, we'd love to hear from you down in the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.